We're just going to take a little bit of time here to review what we went over yesterday. So yesterday we focused on looking at the law of demand. So what are people willing and able to buy? And again, the law of demand essentially has two pieces with it. The first assumption is that when the price of a product decreases, the quantity demanded will increase. So as people see a drop in price of a product, they are going to demand more. If they can get more for their money, they're going to do it. And then the opposite is also true. If the price of a product increases, the quantity demanded will decrease, as people aren't trying to spend more money than they need to. So we can see the law of demand here. Again, this was in the notes from yesterday. Looking at the demand curve and tying in the idea of value. Remember, value and price do not necessarily mean the same thing. And depending on the values that people put on different items, some people with more value who are willing to spend more for a good, you can see here with the demand curve, would be up higher, while people with less value put on an item would be found lower on the demand curve. So what it's worth from one person to the next will differ. Now, again, this demand curve shows how much consumers are willing and able to purchase items at various prices. As we move along this curve, like we did yesterday, this is showing quantity demanded. So that moves up and down the curve. For example, on the next slide here, similar to the practice we had yesterday, let's say that Raising Cane's increases its prices from $7 to $11. So if we were going to graph that, let's say $7 is down here. So that's its original price. Then we follow that over to the demand curve, draw a little dot here, and then follow that down to the quantity demanded. We're going to label that as Q1. However, now we see that Raising Cane's is increasing its prices, so we are going to draw an arrow then up to the $11 mark. You can see here, and then do the same thing. So follow it over to the demand curve, mark it, and then again down to the quantity demanded. So there, that's where we find the new quantity demanded. And as you can see, as the price increased, the quantity demanded decreased. It went from Q1 to Q2, so that showed the law of demand at play. Now, it's important to point out that the opposite could also be true. If Raising Cane started its prices at $11 and then went down to $7, then the quantity demanded would have increased from Q2 back to Q1. So that's an example of the law of demand as we see in quantity demanded. When we're looking at quantity demanded, these two price points that you see here on the curve, that's a change in quantity demanded. And the only thing that can change quantity demanded is a change in price, which is also demonstrated again through the demand schedule that we looked at yesterday. So again, if the price of a product is increasing, if we go from $5 to $10, the quantity demanded will decrease. So instead of demanding 10, the demand goes down to 6, okay? Does anyone have questions about these topics from yesterday before we move on? Give me a chance if you have anything. Okay, it doesn't look like anyone has any questions. So, like we mentioned before, price is the only thing that can change quantity demanded. That's the only thing that can change movement along this curve. So, what if something other than price changes? What if someone loses their job and they were unemployed? How can we use demand then to reflect these types of changes? That's going to be our focus for today. So before we get to the determinants of demand, we need to understand the main idea of what our focus is today, which is looking at changes in demand overall. We're not moving along the curve today. We are essentially moving the curve today, as you can see from this graphic down here. So we're looking at a shift or a move of the demand curve itself. So whenever we're talking about changes in demand, this is moving the demand curve, and it shows that people are willing to buy different amounts at the same price. So if we are increasing the demand, you can see here through this arrow, as I underline it, it is moving to the right. So whenever we are referencing a change in demand, an increase in overall demand, the demand curve is going to shift to the right. Okay. Now you can see here it's the same price as it was from its previous curve, but now the quantity demanded is different. It's higher. And then the opposite could be true as well for decreasing in demand. Whenever we are decreasing demand, let me just erase that here. So whenever we are decreasing demand, the opposite would be true. So a decrease in demand is shown by moving the demand curve to the left. So if we were focusing on the same price point from the old demand curve to the new demand curve, at the same price, but now they're willing to buy less. So that is demonstrating a change in demand. And events, what we're going to focus on today, these are the only things that can cause a change in demand, not price. So before we get to the 5 events that can change demand, we need to first understand what a couple of different terms are. So first, complementary goods. Complementary goods are essentially 2 goods that can go hand in hand with each other. They complement each other, hence the term complementary goods. For example, a burrito bowl and chips at Chipotle. Or if you have an iPad and you like to use a stylus to write on your iPad. Those are examples of complementary goods. So the demand for this good is increased when the price of another good goes down. For example, if the price of your burrito bowl at Chipotle, if they decrease it by $2, then the demand for the chips are going to increase because they save some money on the decrease of the price of the burrito bowl. So the demand for one product will increase when the price of another product goes down, if they're complementary goods. And then substitute goods are just what it sounds like. So a substitute good are 2 goods that can be used for the same purposes. For example, Pepsi and Coke. They're both pops, however, they're just different brands. Same with McDonald's and Burger King. They are both fast food restaurants, just different companies own them. So, for example, if Pepsi raises its prices, if their price increases, the demand for Coke will also increase because people would rather save a few bucks buying Coke rather than go with Pepsi, which would be more expensive. So that's the idea of complementary goods and substitute goods. So now focusing on the big topic of the day, looking at the determinants of demand. So these 5 things that are listed that are numbered and in bold, these are the only 5 things that can cause a demand curve to shift either to the left or to the right. So these are the only things that will cause the demand for a product to either increase or decrease. So the first one is a change in consumer income. So for example, if your income increases, let's say you get a raise at your job, you're making a few $1,000s more a year. As your income increases, so will your demand for what's known as normal goods, essentially the things you buy on a day-to-day basis. And then the opposite is also true. If someone loses their job, they become unemployed, and they have no source of income coming in anymore, then their demand for products will decrease. So change in consumer income is the first determinant that can shift a demand curve. Now, the second one is change in consumer attitudes. You could refer to this as like trends or fads or anything that's popular at the moment. You could also associate this with any changes in seasons. For example, the weather's starting to get a little bit warmer. We're getting closer to summer. So the types of goods that people are buying are going to change and be a lot different than, say, the goods that people were buying in December or January in Minnesota. So change in consumer attitudes will go along with any trends or popular fads of the time. And then again, going back to complementary products. This is the third determinant that can shift a demand curve. So once again, if the price of one product goes down, the demand for the complementary products, the other products that go with it, will increase. If you're saving money on one product, you're going to demand others because you can afford it. And then the opposite is also true. Let's say instead of Chipotle decreasing their price of burrito bowls, they increase it. So if they start to charge $2 more for a burrito bowl, then the demand for that complementary product of chips is going to go down because they're spending more on the bowl now. So that's looking at the impact of complementary products. Then back again to substitute products like Pepsi and Coke. If the price of one of those products increases, the demand for the other product will also increase. Because if they do the same thing, essentially, you'd rather save a few bucks using the other product than paying some more for the other one. And then finally, the number of consumers. This affects overall market demand. Essentially, just the number of people that are now buying products, that will affect the demand for a product, whether it's increasing it or decreasing it. For example, right now, think about all the high demand for hand sanitizer. especially within the last month or two in the United States. Within the last couple of months, the demand curve for hand sanitizer has increased significantly. So we've seen that shift to the right because so many more people are buying it. So the number of consumers can also cause demand curve to shift, whether that's increasing or decreasing. So these are the 5 different types, or 5 different events, if you will, that can shift a demand curve, whether it's increasing it or decreasing it. Does anyone have questions on these 5 right now? Again, I think you guys have the ability to mute or unmute yourself, so feel free to holler out if you have any questions. We're just going to go through a couple of practice rounds with each other, sort of applying these determinants, and then you guys will be set free here in a few minutes. So taking into account some fundamentals before we get to practice, remember, if we are increasing demand, it's always going to shift to the right. An increase is always to the right. And then when we're referencing a decrease in demand, that will always be to the left. I like to think of it like the 2 L's. Left equals less. So if we're decreasing something, it will always go to the left. And then just another thing to point out, we won't be focusing on it today, but a change in quantity demanded, this is what we looked at yesterday, moving up and down that same curve. So the determinants that we are focusing on, that's a shift in demand. We are not focused on the quantity demanded anymore. So let's take this scenario. Let's say there is a decrease in the price of iPads. So Apple has reduced the price of iPads. The market or the product that we are focusing on then is for a stylus. Now, we mentioned this before. The determinant that iPads and stylus have with each other is a change in the price of complementary goods. Stylus and iPads go hand in hand with each other. So we see the first good of iPads, we see their price decrease. As they are saving money on iPads now, the market for stylus will increase, meaning the demand will go up. So if the demand is increasing for the stylus, then we're going to shift it to the right. So to show a shift, you're first going to label your first curve, if you will, as D1. That's our first demand curve. Draw an arrow to the right to show us that it's increasing, and then you draw a new demand curve. And then label that one D2. So that's using the change in the price of complementary goods to show an increase in demand. Now the next practice is that, let's say I lost my job and no longer have an income. The market or the product that I'm focusing on is buying clothes, new clothes. Obviously, the determinant here is a change in consumer income. I no longer have an income because I lost my job. So if I lost my job, I don't have money, I probably shouldn't be buying new clothes. So my demand for these clothes is going to go to the left because my demand is decreasing. So you do the same thing. Again, start off by labeling your first curve D1. Draw an arrow, but this time to the left to signify a decrease, and then you draw your new demand curve and label that D2. So just a couple more to hit this idea home. Practicing now with the change in the price of substitute goods with Coke and Pepsi once again. So the scenario is that Coke has raised its prices by 10%. So the market or the product that we will focus on then is for Pepsi. If Coke is raising its prices, and remember, Coke and Pepsi, they're substitute goods. They can essentially, they're both pops, just different brands. So looking at Coke and Pepsi, if Coke raises its prices, the demand for Pepsi is going to increase. So we are going to shift that curve then to the right. And again, if you want to label them D1 and then D2 to signify which one is the new demand curve. And then just one more practice here. Looking at change in consumer attitude. So let's say TikTok quote unquote influencers start promoting the products of Lululemon. The market that we're focusing on then, the product would be Lululemon leggings. Now it's pretty fair to say that a lot of people use TikTok at the moment. It's pretty trendy. So if a lot of people are on TikTok and they see all these TikTok influencers start to promote Lululemon, then these leggings are going to have a higher demand. So again, shift it to the right, draw an arrow. That's a really bad arrow, sorry. And then draw your new demand curve. So that's essentially showing you the determinants of demand. Does anyone have any questions right now?